Final Fantasy has had its fair share of big bads through the years, each one seemingly more threatening to the order of their specific world than the last. And you can really see the care and thought put into each and every design, as well as the motivations and abilities they would wield. Memorable villains such as Chaos, Golbez or Kefka immediately spring to mind in this regard, and it was their appearances that gave players something to strive towards defeating when they started each and every new Final Fantasy. But when thinking about the most memorable villain, it's hard to think of any that are as iconic, instantly recognizable, and dare we say loved, than Sephiroth. An imposing figure with an even more imposing weapon, Sephiroth captured the minds and hearts of fans of the series when appearing in Final Fantasy VII, but it's carried on so much further, as shown by the extremely well-received reveal trailer for his cameo in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Through a perfect blend of mystery, malice, and masterful visual design, Sephiroth has achieved something few Final Fantasy characters have in the 25 years that followed his debut: worldwide recognition outside of the immediate fanbase. This recognition means that in addition to being one of the most famous Final Fantasy characters, he's also one of the most covered, in anything from lore videos to essays. But despite this, there still exists, both in the Final Fantasy fandom and beyond, an appetite for more information about this enigmatic villain, and it's that appetite we will try and satisfy today. So, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more high quality Final Fantasy content, and from his connections to the development of Final Fantasy VI through to the mysterious exclusion of a certain anatomical feature, let's run through 7 obscure facts about Sephiroth in our typical granular style. End bosses having signature movesets has been a staple in Final Fantasy since the earliest entries, with many sporting unique attacks that did not appear elsewhere in the games they featured in. Some abilities like the Cloud of Darkness's particle beam went on to cameo in future entries, but these abilities were still thought of as signature to their first appearance by fans. It's no surprise then that Sephiroth, being one of Final Fantasy's most well-recognised and iconic villains, had a signature moveset of his own. Moves like Dean, which dealt non-elemental magic damage to the player's party, or Supernova, with its 2-minute long animation runtime, were waiting for anyone who made it to the bottom of the northern crater. By the time Final Fantasy VII Remake came out, players who encountered Sephiroth at the end of the game were expecting to be treated to many, by then familiar Sephiroth staples. And while this is somewhat true, they also quickly found out that Sephiroth had learnt a couple of new tricks in the interceding years. One of these attacks, Hell's Gate, was based on the infamous Aerith's death scene in the original game, and it would see Sephiroth strike the ground, attacking the player with a powerful area of effect burst. Hell's Gate would also appear as a signature move of Sephiroth's in the Dissidia series, as well as Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, where it functioned as his powerful down air maneuver. But while it may feel like the attack had always been part of Sephiroth's repertoire, the first canonical appearance of Hell's Gate as a signature ability for Sephiroth actually came from an unlikely source, a game called Ehrgeiz. Coming out in the year after Final Fantasy VII in Japan, Ehrgeiz, God Bless the Ring, was a 3D arcade fighting game developed by Dream Factory, who had previously worked on the successful Tobal series. It featured an original cast of characters and some very interesting game modes, including an RPG quest mode, but it was perhaps most remembered by fans for the home version's inclusion of a host of Final Fantasy VII characters like Sephiroth, Cloud, and even Zack Fair, who at the time were hot properties for Square. Each would be given extensive movesets that would feature signatures such as Omnislash, and in the case of Sephiroth, it would see the inclusion of Hell's Gate, which could be performed after entering Sephiroth's draw sword stance and then pressing the low attack button. It would see Sephiroth quickly lift his sword high and stab directly downwards into the ground, impaling his opponent in a very similar fashion to the signature move from Final Fantasy VII, and it was so impactful that developers would end up paying reference for years to come. As a fun fact, Ehrgeiz also held the honour of having Sephiroth's very first voice actor, Shinichiro Miki. While Miki would go on to be replaced by Toshiyuki Morikawa, who has been Sephiroth's Japanese voice actor ever since Advent Children, he would then end up becoming the voice actor for Edgar Figaro, while also voicing Cid in Final Fantasy Fable's Chocobo's Dungeon. Sticking with the theme of Sephiroth's voice actors, one of the interesting coincidences relates to an odd connection with Superman, and it's a deeper connection than you first might think. The original Sephiroth voice actor, as we just mentioned, was Shinichiro Miki, but as Sephiroth didn't appear in the initial Japanese version of Kingdom Hearts, the next actor to play the role was actually Lance Bass of NSYNC fame. This is all very common knowledge, but it's what happened next with Sephiroth's voice actor that would end up creating a very odd parallel. And that's because if Sephiroth represented the character who, upon discovering their true nature, sought to do malice to the world, then someone who, upon discovering their true nature, sought to do whatever they could to help the world would be the exact opposite. This extreme juxtaposition is why we found it especially interesting that except for Lance Bass, every other voice actor, Japanese or English, who has played Sephiroth has also voiced or played an incarnation of Superman. The trend started during the casting of Advent Children, as it saw George Newbern replace Lance Bass as Sephiroth. Prior to this, Newbern had played numerous roles, both live action and voiced, but one of the most famous was of Superman and Clark Kent in the 2001 Justice League animated TV series. He's still voicing Superman, even now, having been cast in the upcoming Warner Bros. Fighting game Multiverses, but for the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Newbern was replaced by Tyler Hoechlin. This casting caught many people by surprise, but one of the more interesting elements was that Hoechlin, a lifelong actor who had been acting since he was a child, had also played Superman, having been cast in the role without even having an audition for the character's appearance within Supergirl. Since then, he has appeared in a variety of live-action Superman properties, and he's set to appear in the third season of the CW spin-off called Superman and Lois. But the super interesting part of this fact that you probably didn't know is that Toshiyuki Morikawa, the voice actor who replaced Shinichiro Miki, has also played Superman. Morikawa has had a very prolific career as a voice actor, having appeared in anime like One Piece and video games such as Devil May Cry. In addition, he's also dubbed over many famous actors for Japanese theatrical releases, including Tom Cruise, Keanu Reeves, and Heath Ledger. Being a go-to for overdubbing work, it was no surprise that upon the release of the extremely successful Lego Movie in 2014, Morikawa was called upon once again. And it was in the Lego Movie that he found himself playing not only Superman, but also the main character, Emmett Brakowski, and everyone's favourite intergalactic smuggler, Han Solo. And it means that by this point, it's becoming a bit of a pre- or post-requisite that whoever plays Sephiroth must also play Superman, two characters who, while they do share similarities, are also the antithesis of each other. And as an extra layer to this fact, it's worth noting that Sephiroth was not even Newbern's first credit in a Final Fantasy game. He came to the role by first thoroughly impressing the developers at Square through his performance of Maven Nuge, leader of the Youth League in Final Fantasy X-2. The next fact we have is a bit unorthodox, so stay with us. In his final duel with Cloud at the end of Final Fantasy VII, Sephiroth cast aside his iconic black coat for a more natural look. Sword at the ready, this shirtless incarnation of the iconic villain appeared at an angle, partially obscuring his chest, which has led to a long-running internet mystery regarding the character's more human features, specifically whether or not he had nipples. Interestingly enough, the answer to this burning question was not so easily come by in his future appearances, even when he did decide to do battle or interact with the player lacking clothing on the top half. In Dissidia, for example, Sephiroth's first alternate costume was designed in a specific way that it appeared as though his pectoral muscles were completely uniform, and this was carried forward to Dissidia Opera Omnia many years later, as he once again sported a clever design meant to keep keen-eyed players in the dark, with his signature long hair falling down across his chest in a way that perfectly covered the area in question. Even in his previously mentioned Urgai's appearance, Sephiroth was missing nipples, although to be fair, it seemed like no one in the game had them. Sephiroth was rendered with nipples in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but as he didn't appear shirtless within the actual game, this was only found out when people started dissecting the game's assets. So for most people, it wasn't until Super Smash Bros. Ultimate that Square Enix would confirm this odd bit of trivia. Sephiroth did indeed canonically have nipples, proving once and for all that despite all his Genova cells, he was indeed human, like the rest of us. However, this was not the first time the fact was confirmed, as Sephiroth's anatomy was addressed way back in 2009 at the Square Enix showcase in Tokyo, where a life-sized model of Sephiroth, complete with nipples, was on display for those in attendance to see. Another element that was in full force for Sephiroth's appearance in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate was One Winged Angel, an iconic piece of music that's still as terror-inducing and awe-inspiring now as it was when players heard it all those years ago. While this particular reorchestration really brought the grandeur and power of the song to the forefront, modernizing it with fresh metal guitar riffs and choral chanting, none of that would have been possible without the extremely solid composition of the original. Thanks to other pieces such as Final Fantasy VI's Dancing Mad, it was clear by Final Fantasy VII that series composer Nobuo Uematsu was a true master of his craft. We can only speculate how Uematsu has managed to compose as many works as he has over the years, but amazingly, we are lucky enough to have some insight into how he ended up putting together One Winged Angel. Speaking with Polygon in 2017, Uematsu revealed that his process for writing One Winged Angel was a little unorthodox when compared to how he had previously composed in the past. After writing music for 6 mainline games and countless other games produced by Square, he decided to take a different approach to the soundtrack of Final Fantasy VII, asking himself, what would it sound like to perform a take on late 60s and early 70s music with a full orchestra? This fusion of styles had Uematsu trying to blend the destructive power of rock with classical music, looking to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring for inspiration, but he ultimately found the structure that he was working on boring and went back to the drawing board. In an effort to switch things up, he came up with a new idea. He would, without any preconceived ideas of overall structure, write 1 or 2 musical phrases every day until he had collected about 20 or 30 wholly different phrases. Upon completing the exercise, Uematsu then arranged and rearranged the pieces together like a musical collage or puzzle until he ultimately settled on something that he was comfortable with. As an aside, while One Winged Angel would go on to win many other fans thanks to its stunning live choir samples, not all players of Final Fantasy VII would be treated to quite the same version of Uematsu's vision for Sephiroth's theme. And this was because players of the original PC port done by Eidos were instead treated to a rendition of the tune through their PC's sound card rather than the audio files of the PlayStation. This meant that not only did the PC version of the entire soundtrack have a different vibe depending on your computer's specs, but also, unfortunately for some, the extremely memorable chanting of Sephiroth in One Winged Angel was replaced by a generic choir synth. The influence of Final Fantasy VII on Square's other works is easy to spot, with character cameos, direct references and allusions having appeared throughout a variety of titles. Whether it be the overt inclusion of characters like Cloud and Sephiroth in the aforementioned Urgais, or how Cloud's Buster Sword could be spotted in the weapon shop in Final Fantasy IX, the legacy of Final Fantasy VII has been ever present in a ton of games developed by Square and then Square Enix. One of them was almost immediate, as an Amnesia version of Cloud sneakily made his way into Final Fantasy Tactics. But did you know that Sephiroth also had a connection to the now critically acclaimed tactical RPG? Enter Marquis Messam Elmdor de Limberry, also known as Marquis Mestram Elmdor, who ruled over Limberry in Final Fantasy Tactics. A devout member of the Church of Glabados, he fought on the side of the Order of the Southern Sky in the War of the Lions, and was ultimately defeated by Ramza at Limberry Castle after becoming host to the Lucavi demon Zalira. Being a silver-haired Arc-Knight who wielded a katana, Elmdor's resemblance to Sephiroth was uncanny, but the similarities went so much deeper. For starters, Elmdor's backstory had a lot in common with Sephiroth's. Both characters had been war heroes in their lives prior to the events of the games they appeared in, with Sephiroth being the hero of the Wutai War, with Elmdor being known as the Silver Prince and Silver Demon to allies and enemies respectively from the 50 Years' War. In addition, both would end up being mortally wounded, but ultimately revived due to their fusion with a powerful, non-human entity. Furthermore, both characters would wield the legendary Masamune in battle, named so after the famous real-life Japanese swordmaker, and would be dressed in all black, with Elmdor's first combat encounter having him specifically decked out in both the black cowl and black robe items, both common descriptions of Sephiroth's outfit in Final Fantasy VII. This connection would then be cemented just over 2 decades later, as Sephiroth was given an alternative costume in Dissidia NT that directly resembled Elmdor. Called the Operative of Legend 2, the outfit would see Sephiroth's character model recolored to more closely resemble Elmdor's appearance, with his hair color being changed and the sash under his coat and pauldron made red. As much as Elmdor's appearance and backstory were influenced by Sephiroth, Sephiroth himself was in part influenced by many things that came before him. Equal parts Sasagi Kojiro and Jaws, the team working on Final Fantasy VII wanted to create a villain unlike any the series had seen prior, one that truly embodied the terror and power they intended to base the entire game's plot around. Sephiroth was designed by Tetsuya Nomura, but prior to his involvement with Final Fantasy VII as the lead designer, Nomura had also worked on Final Fantasy VI, where he designed some of the key enemies featured in the game. And it's from his time as the designer on this game that we see the genesis point of ideas that would later become integrated into Sephiroth. Featured in the final dungeon of Final Fantasy VI, Kefka's Tower, was a boss enemy named the Fiend or Doom. Designed by Nomura, this enemy featured large demon wings, a horned head, and 4 muscular arms, its body fused to the demonic pillar. A malicious manifestation of one of the 3 warring triads, the gods who brought the magic to the world, the Fiend would battle the player before their final battle against Kefka in a back-to-back boss rush. What's lesser known though is the original name for the fiend featured in Nomura's concept art was in fact Sephiroth, or specifically Sephiroth. Taking inspiration from the Kabbalah, where the Sephiroth are the manifestations of God that allow him to exist in the physical and metaphysical universes, Nomura used this name as the working title of the enemy until it was replaced by the fiend later in development. The same etymology was then reused for the creation of Final Fantasy VII's Sephiroth. Here the allusions to the Kabbalah made more sense, as Sephiroth existed simultaneously in both the livestream and the real world, where he executed his plans through Genova. Like with most Final Fantasy references, it would not be until Final Fantasy XIV that the name of Sephiroth would finally be used as an alternative name for the fiend, although officially it would be under the slightly altered Sephiroth, so as to avoid any confusion. Featured in Heaven's Ward's Warring Triad raid series, players would find the fiend as a trapped primal sealed away by the Allagan Empire. In battle, he appeared extremely similar to the Final Fantasy VI iteration, once again sporting demon wings, a horned helm, and multiple muscular arms. The Sephiroth's connection to Final Fantasy VI is not linked by name only. As we previously talked about Sephiroth's Hell's Gate attack, it's worth talking about his other signature ability, Heartless Angel. This would be associated to Sephiroth across the entire compilation and the Dissidia series, but this attack was first used by Kefka Palazzo. Called Fallen One in the Super Nintendo version, this move was so tied to the appearance in Final Fantasy VI that in future appearances of Kefka in Dissidia and 14, it again resurfaced as a featured signature ability. The idea of Fallen Angel end bosses using this signature attack even extended to Lightning Returns' Bonavelza, who got to take it for a spin in the final battle against Lightning. And that brings us on to our final fact, that Sephiroth's signature weapon, the Masamune, had a replica that could be obtained by the player not only in Final Fantasy VII, but also in Dissidia and Duodecim. Obtained in the Gold Saucer through the Speed Squares Shooting Coaster minigame, the Masamune Blade was won by scoring more than 3,000 points in a single attempt, alongside other possible prizes such as the 135th Soldier and the Super Sweeper. It was a special item and was not able to be equipped by anyone in the party, with its description reading that it was a perfect copy of Sephiroth's sword. It was in Dissidia and Duodecim that players would finally be able to wield this replica weapon as Sephiroth himself no less. Purchasable from the shop for a slight fee and some tradable items, the Masamune Blade was featured as a level 53 and level 30 exclusive weapon respectively, and was characteristically weaker than the real Masamune. As its original appearance was a bit of a joke, its continued appearance in the Final Fantasy canon as a signature, albeit weaker version of Sephiroth's Masamune is a fun little nod to the original game. In addition, the Masamune Blade continued the series' tradition of including knockoff versions of legendary weapons as a joke, such as Final Fantasy V's Excalibur. And as a bonus fact here, while the real Masamune was not obtainable by the player through legitimate means in 7, the stats of the legendary weapon could be seen in-game. In the brief, playable Nibelheim flashback sequence where Sephiroth was in the player's party, looking at his equipment provided some valuable insights into what made this weapon so good. Sporting 6 materia slots in linked pairs, the weapon had no materia growth, a trait common for ultimate weapons, a 255 hit rate, 99 attack power, and a whopping 100% critical hit rate. And with that, I think we're done. They were 7 obscure facts about Sephiroth you probably didn't know, but I'm sure there were still some amongst you who knew them all. Let us know in the comments below which fact you found to be the most interesting, and if you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and be sure to subscribe to the channel. With that, this is Darryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, DeLivestream and Gregory, who are super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.